The truth was not supposed to come out this way. For a long time, your soulmate believed there was nothing left to discover about what happened between you. They had already created their own explanation, accepted certain answers, and made peace with a version of the past that seemed complete. But then, someone finally said something they were never meant to hear, and suddenly the entire story began to look different. It wasn't a dramatic announcement. It may have started with a quiet conversation, a question asked at the wrong moment, or a person finally reaching the point where keeping silent felt heavier than telling the truth. And the moment your soulmate heard those first few words, something inside them immediately shifted. They knew this wasn't just another opinion. This person knew something. Something about the past. Something about you. Something that had been happening behind closed doors while your soulmate was looking at the situation from the outside. At first, they may have tried to stay calm. They may have convinced themselves that whatever they were about to hear couldn't possibly change anything. After all, they had lived with their version of the story for so long. They had already decided who was right, who was wrong, what happened, and why the connection became so complicated. But then the confession continued. One detail appeared, then another, and suddenly pieces of the past that never seemed to fit began sliding into place. Your soulmate may have remembered conversations they once dismissed, moments that seemed strange at the time, and reactions from you that they never fully understood. They may have remembered the way you became quiet when certain subjects came up. They may remember how quickly you pulled away from certain situations. They may remember thinking you were hiding something, when in reality there may have been something happening that you simply couldn't explain. And now someone is finally telling them what was happening when nobody else was watching. This is why their shock is so intense. They aren't hearing a completely unfamiliar story. They're hearing an explanation for things they already witnessed but never understood. Imagine looking at the same photograph for years, believing you know what happened, and then suddenly discovering that the photograph was taken from only one side of the room. Everything you saw was real, but it wasn't everything that existed. That's what is happening inside your soulmate's mind right now. They are realizing that the truth wasn't necessarily hidden because it didn't exist. It was hidden because they were never shown the entire picture. And the person confessing may have known more than they ever admitted. They may have watched events unfold from a distance. They may have known what was said when your soulmate wasn't there. They may have witnessed a decision, a conversation, or a moment that completely changes how your soulmate understands you. The most unsettling part is that this confession may explain why certain things never made sense before. Why did you react that way? Why did you suddenly become distant? Why did someone behave differently around you? Why did the connection change so quickly? Why did your soulmate feel like there was always something missing from the story? Now, for the first time, those questions may have answers. But your soulmate isn't ready for what comes next, because the person revealing the truth has not finished talking. And the next thing they confess may force your soulmate to realize that what they believed about you was only the surface of what was really happening. What your soulmate heard next was not a simple explanation. It was the missing piece that made several old memories suddenly make sense. Until this moment, they had been looking at the past from the outside, judging what they could see without knowing what was happening underneath it all. But now, someone was finally opening a door that had remained closed for far too long. The confession may have started with something small, almost insignificant, but with every sentence, the weight of the truth became harder to ignore. Your soulmate began realizing that there were conversations they were never part of, decisions they never knew were being made, and emotions that existed behind the scenes while they were trying to understand everything from a distance. And perhaps the most surprising part was discovering that you may have been affected by all of it without them ever knowing. They may have believed you simply changed. They may have thought your behavior came out of nowhere. They may have assumed you were becoming distant because your feelings had changed. But the person speaking now is revealing details that challenge that entire assumption. Suddenly, your soulmate is remembering moments that once seemed strange. The day you became unusually quiet. The time you seemed emotionally overwhelmed but refused to explain why. The moment you stopped arguing and simply walked away. Back then, those moments may have looked like choices you were making against them. Now they may look completely different. They may have been reactions to something your soulmate never knew was happening. And this is where the confession becomes deeply uncomfortable, because the truth may involve another person's words, influence, or decisions. Someone may have said something when you weren't present. Someone may have presented information without giving the entire context. Someone may have encouraged your soulmate to see a situation from only one direction. And because your soulmate trusted what they heard, they never stopped to ask what was happening on your side of the story. But now they are beginning to understand how easily a person's perception can be changed when they only receive one piece of information. It doesn't always require a complete lie. Sometimes all it takes is leaving out the one detail that would have changed everything. That missing detail may be exactly what this confession has finally exposed. Your soulmate may be sitting there silently replaying the past, realizing that certain events were never as simple as they appeared. They may remember someone acting strangely around you. They may remember a conversation ending abruptly. They may remember being told something about you that never completely felt right, yet they accepted it because they didn't have another explanation. Now that uncomfortable feeling is returning, only this time it has somewhere to go. The pieces are beginning to connect. The person confessing may explain why certain things happened, why someone behaved the way they did, or why you reacted in ways your soulmate never understood. And with every answer, another question appears. If this was happening behind closed doors, what else was kept from them? How long had someone known? Why did nobody speak sooner? And most importantly, why were they allowed to believe a version of events that left you carrying the consequences? Your soulmate may not even know how to respond at first. Shock can make people quiet. Sometimes the truth is so different from what you expected that there is no immediate reaction strong enough to express it. They may simply sit with it, remembering you, remembering their decisions, and realizing that the past contains far more than they ever understood. But then comes the detail that changes the emotional meaning of everything. The confession doesn't just explain what happened around you. It reveals something about what you were feeling at the time. And once your soulmate understands that part, they may finally realize why you behaved the way you did, why you stopped explaining yourself, and why you eventually chose silence. That is when this confession stops being a story about what happened behind closed doors and becomes something much more personal. Because your soulmate is about to discover that while they thought you were choosing to walk away from them, you may have been dealing with something they never even knew existed. The confession changes the atmosphere completely because your soulmate is no longer listening to a possibility. They are hearing details that connect directly to moments they personally experienced. And suddenly, the past doesn't feel distant anymore. It feels like something's standing right in front of them, asking to be understood one more time. They may begin remembering how different you seemed during that period, how your energy changed, how certain conversations ended before they could truly begin. At the time, they may have interpreted those moments through emotion, frustration, or the information they had been given. But now they are looking at them with a completely different understanding. One memory leads to another, and then another, until they realize there was a pattern they never noticed. You weren't simply behaving differently. You were responding to circumstances they couldn't see. And that realization can be difficult because it forces your soulmate to question their own judgment. They may remember moments when they were convinced they knew what you were thinking, only to realize now that they were filling in the blanks with assumptions. They may remember something someone told them about you and suddenly recognize how incomplete it was. They may even remember being encouraged to make a decision that, at the time, felt completely reasonable. Now they are wondering who benefited from that decision and why they were never given the full picture. This is where the confession becomes more than information. It becomes a confrontation with the past. Your soulmate may feel as though they are meeting an older version of themselves, the person who made choices without knowing what they know today. And there is no easy way to explain that away. They cannot change what they believed back then, but they can finally understand why certain consequences followed. Perhaps they now realize that your silence wasn't an admission of guilt. Perhaps your withdrawal wasn't a sign that you stopped caring. Perhaps the moment you stopped fighting was not because you had nothing left to feel, but because you had reached the point where being misunderstood had become more painful than being alone. That possibility can hit your soulmate hard, because suddenly your absence carries a completely different meaning. They may remember how quickly you stopped explaining yourself after realizing nobody was truly listening. They may remember expecting you to chase, defend, prove, and convince them. Instead, you eventually became quiet. At the time, they may have thought that silence answered everything. Now, they may understand that silence sometimes happens when someone has already exhausted every possible way of being heard. And this realization can bring a very different kind of emotion. Not just sadness, not just longing, regret. The kind of regret that arrives when someone realizes they had an opportunity to understand another person and didn't take it. Your soulmate may start wondering what would have happened if they had asked one more question, waited one more day, or listened to your side without allowing outside voices to shape their conclusion. They may replay the final moments between you and search for signs they missed. They may suddenly notice that you were telling them something without directly saying it. And the more they remember, the more obvious it becomes that the story they accepted was never complete. But there is one detail from the confession that your soulmate cannot get out of their mind. It reveals not only what happened around you, but what someone knew about your feelings at the time. And when your soulmate hears that part, the shock begins turning into something much deeper. Because now they aren't simply questioning what they were told. They're realizing that you may have been carrying the truth alone while they were unknowingly making decisions based on everything except it. And now your soulmate is reaching the part of the truth that changes how they see you completely. Until this point, they were trying to understand what happened. Now they are beginning to understand what it cost you. That difference matters. Facts can explain an event, but they cannot fully explain what someone felt while living through it. The confession has opened that emotional layer, and your soulmate is finally seeing the situation from your side instead of through the version they were given. They may suddenly understand why you became quieter, why you stopped asking for explanations, why certain conversations made you uncomfortable, or why you eventually stopped trying to convince anyone of your intentions. What once looked like a choice now looks like a consequence. What once seemed like indifference now carries the weight of someone who had already been hurt too many times. And perhaps this is the realization that affects them most. You may have been hoping they would understand without realizing how much effort it was taking for you to keep hoping. Your soulmate may remember how you used to communicate, how you tried to keep the connection alive, how you gave opportunities for things to be clarified. Then they remember the point where you stopped, not because your feelings disappeared overnight, but because something inside you finally accepted that you could not force someone to see what they were unwilling to see. That realization can be incredibly painful for your soulmate, because it means your distance may not have been the beginning of the problem. It may have been the final result of everything that happened before it. Suddenly, they can see the chain of events differently. One misunderstanding led to another. One assumption created another. One piece of outside information changed the way they interpreted your actions, and eventually, the distance between you became larger than either of you knew how to cross. Your soulmate may now be wondering whether the separation could have been avoided if they had known the truth sooner. They may even feel guilty for moments when they blamed you for things that were never entirely within your control. But underneath that regret is another emotion they may not have expected: admiration. Because despite everything that was happening behind the scenes, you continued moving forward. You didn't expose every detail. You didn't publicly defend yourself. You didn't spend your entire life trying to correct every misunderstanding. You simply carried what you knew and allowed time to reveal what words couldn't. And now time has done exactly that. It has brought the truth to the person who needed to hear it. Your soulmate may begin to realize that your strength wasn't in never being hurt. It was in refusing to let being misunderstood turn you into someone you weren't. They may see that you didn't become cruel because someone treated you unfairly. You didn't become bitter because things went wrong. You simply learned when to stop giving pieces of yourself to situations that were no longer giving you peace. That can completely change the way they remember you. The person they once thought was difficult to reach may now appear incredibly patient. The person they thought was emotionally distant may now seem like someone who had been protecting a very sensitive heart. And the person they believed had simply moved on may actually have been someone who had finally learned how to choose themselves. But there is something else your soulmate cannot escape now. The person who confessed this truth may have revealed more than what happened. They may have unintentionally revealed why your soulmate never knew. And that creates another layer of shock, because your soulmate now has to question not only the past, but the people they trusted while that past was unfolding. They may start looking at old conversations differently, wondering who knew what, who remained silent, and why nobody gave them the chance to understand you when it could have mattered most. And once those questions begin, they don't stop easily. Because your soulmate is no longer simply grieving what happened. They are beginning to understand that the story could have been very different if the truth had arrived earlier. And that is the thought that may stay with them long after the confession ends. Maybe they didn't lose you because the connection wasn't strong enough. Maybe they lost you because they understood the truth too late. The confession is over, but the impact of what your soulmate heard is only beginning. They may walk away from that conversation looking calm on the outside, yet internally, everything has changed. There are certain truths you can hear and simply move past, and then there are truths that rearrange the entire meaning of your memories. This is one of those truths. Your soulmate now knows that there was more happening behind closed doors than they ever understood, and they can no longer look at the past through the same lens. They may find themselves going back through old conversations, not searching for evidence against you anymore, but searching for the moments when you were quietly telling them what they couldn't see. And the more they remember, the heavier the realization becomes. They may finally understand why you stopped explaining, why you stopped waiting, why you eventually chose peace instead of continuing to fight for someone to believe your heart. Perhaps they once thought you simply gave up on the connection. Now they may realize that you didn't give up easily at all. You reached a point where continuing to prove yourself was costing you more than walking away. That realization can create a very different kind of regret. Your soulmate isn't only regretting what happened, they're regretting the way they responded to what happened. They may wish they had asked you more questions. They may wish they had ignored the outside voices and listened directly to you. They may wish they had noticed the pain behind your silence instead of interpreting it as rejection. But time doesn't offer people the chance to rewrite every decision. Sometimes it only gives them the understanding they needed much earlier. And that is where your soulmate may find themselves now, standing in the present while mentally returning to a past they can no longer change. They may wonder whether you would even believe them if they finally told you that they know the truth now. They may wonder whether too much damage has already been done. They may wonder if you still carry the same feelings, or whether you have finally released everything they once represented in your life. Those questions can create hesitation, because approaching you would require something they haven't been ready to give before: honesty without excuses. If they ever return, they cannot return with the same story. They cannot pretend nothing happened. They cannot expect you to forget what their misunderstanding cost you. They would have to acknowledge what they now know, And perhaps that is why the confession matters so much. It doesn't guarantee what happens next. It simply removes the illusion that the past was what your soulmate thought it was. The truth has changed the foundation beneath their memories. What once looked like an ending may now look like the consequence of circumstances neither of you fully understood. What once looked like your choice to leave may now look like the moment you finally stopped hurting yourself to keep something alive. And what once looked like a lack of love may now appear to have been love, pushed beyond its limit. Your soulmate may still need time to process all of this. They may become quieter before they become more open. They may watch from a distance before making any move. They may need to confront their own guilt before they can approach you with sincerity. But there is one thing they cannot do anymore: unknow the truth. The confession has changed that forever. And perhaps the most powerful part of this entire story is that you didn't have to force the truth into the light. You didn't have to expose everyone. You didn't have to chase your soulmate with explanations. You kept moving while the truth found its own way back to the person who needed to hear it. Now your soulmate is left with a choice. They can allow the truth to become another painful memory, or they can let it change the way they approach you, the way they understand the connection, and the way they take responsibility for what happened. Because sometimes the universe doesn't bring the truth back to recreate what was lost. Sometimes it brings the truth back so that nobody has to carry a false story anymore. And if your soulmate does decide to come forward, the most important thing won't be what they say first. It will be whether their actions finally match what they now understand. They once believed they knew the whole story. Now they know they didn't. They once thought they understood you. Now they realize there were entire chapters they never saw. And that realization may stay with them for a very long time, because there is one truth they can no longer escape. They didn't lose the connection because there was nothing real between you. They lost their understanding of it long before they lost you. And now that understanding has finally returned.